Welcome. I see some people trickling in here. Thank you for being here with us.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Happy Wednesday, middle of the week.
Hump day.
Hump day. What, Mike, hump day. Good morning, Dawn. Welcome in, everybody.
As you're coming in, if you can just name drop who you are, where you're at, and maybe a tidbit about the weather. How's your weather? See who's soaking in some good weather, and some of us that wish we had better weather.
Dreary Seattle. Yeah.
Used to live in Seattle. I know that very well.
Oh yeah, go Dogs. How about those Georgia Bulldogs on Monday, taking the national championship? A lot of 30-degree weather today, Clay. I'm at about 34 here in my town. How about you? What's your temp, Clay?
28 degrees, which is nice and warm for Minneapolis. And in January, we'll take that weather for sure.
Does that mean it's optional jackets if it's 30?
Well, some people, yeah, you'll see them in short sleeve, probably.
Yeah.
It's bizarre. Coming from California, never thought I'd see it or do it myself, but now I understand it. It's like nice.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for dropping us in, your name and where you're tuning in from. We're also talking about the weather today.
We'll give it another couple of minutes here. Let some people transition from what they were doing to the webinar, and we'll get right into the content here in just a minute.
Oh, there's my friend James. James, what's up from New York, my friend? We gotta do that cartwheel challenge again.
There's a story there.
Oh, there is a story. That'll be an offline story. Yes. Counselor Cartwheel Challenge, we brought it state lines, Arizona to New York, viral on Twitter. It's a cool story. Boy, Atlanta's a little on the chilly side this morning, Pam, 48 degrees. Thanks for letting us know where you're zooming in from this fine Wednesday morning, mid-morning.
Yeah, I think we'll just go ahead and get started as people come in. We just want to thank everybody for being here with us today, whether you're tuning in kind of live with us or whether you're watching this as a recording. This webinar we've pulled together is really talking about the top 3 ways we can use ESSER funding to promote student and staff social emotional well-being and mental health. There's a variety of ways in which ESSER funds can be used. We're really going to talk about 3 ways in which those funds can be leveraged in ways to build capacity towards addressing kind of more immediate needs in order for kids to recover and bounce back from things that have happened, and also be planning for the future. So my name is Dr. Clay Cook. I'm the Chief Development Officer at CharacterStrong. I really get the privilege to have that seat in the organization. We're an organization committed to making the world a better, more loving place. I'm a former professor who's conducted scientific research on implementation strategies that promote students' access to social, emotional, and behavioral supports as part of their educational experiences. I've been able to work with school systems all across the country on designing and implementing multi-tiered systems of support as ways to increase student access to the experiences and supports they need to be well. I think most importantly, I'm a former paraprofessional, middle school math teacher, and a school psychologist. And so I bring those practical experience and combine it with research to help translate evidence-based knowledge to educators. And I'm here with Kat. There's not too many people on this planet who can say they are a National School Counselor of the Year recipient. And so I get to share the stage today with one of those people.
Aw, thanks, Dr. Cook. Yeah, so welcome in, everybody. What an honor it is to be with you this morning, and to be able to collaborate with Dr. Cook has just been a dream of mine, and CharacterStrong made that come true today. And so we're really excited about our topic And as Dr. Cook elaborated, I was a school counselor for 16 years, and before that worked at Northern Arizona University. So have over 20 years of experience in education and various roles. And so looking forward to speaking on this topic and continuing to engage. My role at CharacterStrong is the director of school support. So a new role for me, a new place in education for me. So it's been a great journey so far, and being able to be a part of the CharacterStrong team doing this work in schools across the world really is just been a dream come true. So really excited to work with you today. Just a couple of tips. We're going to be engaging with you a lot. We're going to be asking some reflection questions as we go along. And so just, you'll notice that there's the Q&A box, and then there's also the chat. So feel free to drop any questions and or responses that we come up to as we move along. And we're going to get into our very first question of the day, which is, what was important for schools to prioritize before the pandemic, but is now critically important for prioritizing now and in the future? So what was important? You knew it was important, but now there's a light shined on it that's even more important. If you could let us know your opinion on that. Great. Relationships and SEL. Yes. Social emotional learning. Oh, Nicole, great. Building strong relationships with your families. Perfect.
Yeah, we knew there was needs before the pandemic, but the pandemic, in my view, has been, there was fires, but this has been something that's been like lighter fluid. And so the issues that we know were needed to address before have been heightened. And so now we can't ignore them, but they're going to continue to be important into the future.
Yeah. And Shelley brings out the SEL for students, families, and staff. SEL for all.
An all human proposition. We all have those needs, and they impact whether we engage and whether we can plug into any meaningful experience.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those. We'll keep those coming. We'll keep responding to you in the chat.
So we wanted to just use a quote to kind of frame the current situation. We know that the pandemic has brought a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, and in many ways it's created what can feel like crisis or actual crises in our school systems. But I think this is the optimism and the hope, is that through this, there's certain things that become really clear that are important. And there are great opportunities in the face of crisis because we start to learn about what's needed. It was needed before. Now we can't ignore those needs. And we can strategically use the infusion of funds that come from ESSER to really think about the opportunities to address students and staff needs now, but also be planning for the future. So in the midst of everything that's going on, there is great opportunity to leverage the infusion of ESSER funds in very strategic ways to create sustainable supports for both staff and students.
Yeah, and never in this time have we had such an influx of funding into education. Education is many times underfunded and under-resourced. So we're just going to do a quick overview of some ESSER funds. As we know, we have a variety of people on our call today. So under the American Rescue Plan, ARP, which became law back in March 2021, school districts around the country will receive funding to address the impacts of COVID on a student's academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs. This new funding source is also known as ESSER 3. So Elementary, Secondary, and School Elementary Relief Fund receives its numerical donation from the fact that ARP is the third set of COVID-related federal relief grants from Congress that passed since the pandemic began. So for those of you who have not seen the official guidance from the Department of Education, we're going to drop an ARP ESSER fact sheet for your reference, as we're not going to be conducting what we would call a deep dive into ESSER funds today, but we wanted to give a high-level overview of the very positions on the webinar today. So again, those ESSER 3 funds are really intended to address students' academic, social, emotional needs, particularly for our underrepresented student subgroups, which include every major racial and ethnic group, children from low-income families, children with disabilities, our English language learners, gender migrant students, students experiencing homelessness, and children of youth in foster care. As we continue on, with our next slide, here's just another way to look at those specific areas within the ESSER funding. And the first and most crucial step is determining where the greatest need exists and how to achieve the greatest impact possible. Schools need to prioritize and synthesize this work, and you need to think about a design backward process with this. So this is just an easy way for you to see those funding resource areas from the specific language of the ESSER document, the school and student needs, and how CharacterStrong is aligned to those needs. And we're going to be spending time talking about 3 specific needs today as we move along in our presentation. The next piece here is really to think and how this hones in on your state specific approved plan. So we're also going to drop for you this link where you can find out the exact details of your state, how much each state was allocated, the plan that was sent for approval, and the plan that was approved, and then the communication part that's going to be coming out from your state. This is a really simple way to see the details of your plan and help you be informed and help you lead those conversations and this movement forward in your state, at your school, and in your district. Again, those remaining ELA funds 20% must be allocated, at least a minimum, right, Dr. Clay, at least a minimum of 20% addressed to the impact of lost instructional time, but also to hone in on the social emotional learning and mental wellness of our staff and students.
So at CharacterStrong, we tend to put this within an implementation kind of framework and mindset. So we know that staff and students can't benefit from solutions they don't receive. ESSER funds really are motivated to put solutions in place that address existing needs and planning for sustainability. And so what you're seeing here is kind of an implementation process framework through which schools can be super strategic to first explore and identify and define what their needs are and make sure they're selecting solutions that address kind of the root causes for why those needs exist. But rushing to implement a solution without preparing people and creating readiness is likely to produce experiences where staff and students don't actually receive the solution. So preparation, creating that readiness is essential, and that's all motivated for eventually achieving sustainability in those solutions. Eventually, ESSER funds will dry up. In the year 2024, they'll go away. And many of us that have been around in education long enough, we know if we're not planning for sustainability at the outset, grant funds, resources dry up, and a lot of the time those implementation efforts eventually evaporate out of the system. So this is an opportunity to use a proven implementation process framework to be super strategic at each phase of that implementation process in order to eventually get to sustainability in the types of change that is needed so staff and students receive the supports they need to be well, engage fully in the experiences, and continue to develop and grow. So here are the 3 issues that we think are super important around social emotional well-being and mental health of staff and students, and how ESSER funds can be used very strategically. And we're going to go over each one of these, starting with implementation of multi-tiered systems of support. We're going to dive into school-based mental health, where there's some reports that we'll touch on where youth mental health is in a level of kind of crisis and necessitates school-based responses. And last, we'll dig into the adult SEL component and how do we center some of the work around the adults to ensure they're well so they can be best in the service of students. So I'm going to jump in here first around kind of implementation of multi-tiered systems of support. We'll have a structured process to go through this. We're going to talk about the why, and then we're going to talk about how the ESSER funds could be strategically used with that idea of addressing more immediate needs now and also building for sustainability in the future. So why use it? There's one thing to have a lens of equity where people have beliefs and mindsets around equity work, but there's another thing to actually have a service delivery model through which we organize all the work we do in schools to make sure each and every kid is able to access the level of support they need to be successful in school. And at the heart, MTSS is essentially that operating system that helps organize everything we do to create access. Equity is driven by access, and MTSS is the model we use to actually organize a continuum of care to make sure each and every kid is able to access what they need. And many systems, if you look at it, are struggling with MTSS implementation because the outcomes of MTSS are only realized through successful implementation of tier 1 practices that all kids take in, selected targeted interventions for some kids who need more support above and beyond, and then intensive interventions for a few kids who have needs that go above and beyond other students. So the way we think about this is kind of a layering and intensification of support. ESSER funds can really be used to dig in and do work around tier 1, doubling down on that tier 1 prevention, promotion, and acceleration. And I like to think that a robust tier 1 environment is really about kids accessing everything they need. And if they do need something else, those foundational supports enable more intensive interventions to work. And there's a parallel here. You can imagine like tier 1 is a dirty pond and there's a kid swimming in it. If you take the kid out of the dirty pond and the intervention is to hose them off, but the kid has to go back into the dirty pond, it's going to weaken the effects of the intervention. And a lot of times we're expecting too much out of our interventions and we realize we have fractures in our tier 1 support. So MTSS is really an opportunity to think about tier 1. What are the experiences that each and every kid needs to take in socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and academically that could be preventative from any problems, that it could be protective of any issues from emerging, and it can promote and accelerate kids' well-being and success. And that's when once we have that solid foundation, we can begin to really strategically layer on additional support. So I want to talk about kind of another reason why we would want to invest in implementation of MTSS. I like to think about the core concepts of MTSS never going away from the educational system. And a way to think about this is think about the opposite of the core components. What's the opposite of multiple tiers of integrated supports? One size fits all. Are we going to go in the future to a model where we're just going to go to a one size fits all? Or will we continuously try to improve the continuum of care we provide to match to the level of student need? What's the opposite of effective or evidence-based practices? Maybe ineffective or potentially harmful. We're only going to get better and hopefully identify more effective ways of doing business. And that's a core concept. So an investment in MTSS isn't a fad or a trend. It's going to stick around. What's the opposite of proactive detection? Waiting for kids to fail. Would medicine wait for people to die? Or are they trying to get better ways to detect needs and be responsive to those needs? That's at the core of good MTSS work. They're either screening or using other detection methods. Diagnostic assessments to tailor interventions. Now, what that means is trying to get the right intervention in place for the right kid, rather than many school systems are shooting in the dark. There's no rhyme or reason for why kids get interventions. It's often based on what we call the availability heuristic. Whatever support's available, the kid gets. Unfortunately, that's imprecise, and the success rate of our intervention efforts goes down dramatically versus having what we call diagnostic assessments, where we tailor and match kids to very precise interventions. So you get the point. Why do we want to invest in MTSS? Because it's not a fad or a trend. It's not going to go away. These core concepts will always be important into the future. So that's why investing in now can address students' needs to create access, and we can start to build for sustainability. So how do we go about this? It's all about using the science of implementation from our perspective. MTSS is fundamentally an implementation-focused model where it's granting students access to higher quality experiences and supports. So at CharacterStrong, we have customized implementation supports, and this is really our approach to help guide schools strategically through each phase of the implementation process to get each of those phases right in order to produce high fidelity of implementation. High fidelity implementation is code for kids are accessing the effective practices in a way that could be beneficial for them. And so we increase the likelihood of getting to the outcomes we want for students. So everything boils down to implementation, and that implementation really requires strategic decision-making and supports along each of those steps along the pathway towards sustainability. And so that's the way in which we think the ESSER funds could be really used in an optimal way, is to really focus on implementation supports to actually bring to life MTSS so kids access higher quality experiences and supports.
So we've been talking for about 15 minutes. Now it's time to make sure we still have you actively engaged with us today. So let's take a look at this prompt. Pull up the chat for us, if you will. What is one thing that stood out to you in the MTSS section related to building capacity for systemic change? Reflect on that for a little bit, and then we'll see what we got.
And Kat and I recognize that a lot of this information, it's not new information. MTSS has been around for a while, but they're really important reminders around why is MTSS being advocated? What's the science behind it? If we actually build an MTSS framework to scale, what are the types of outcomes we can expect? So they're good reminders for people to sit back and reflect, is this a good use of our ESSER funds to really focus on implementing an integrated MTSS framework?
Yeah, some great recall here, Dr. Cook, from your section here. Dirty Pond definitely struck a chord with people today, and implementation requires application. And as a school counselor, this speaks to me very clearly, as this is one of my major roles on our campuses, was those tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supports, and making students not just casting the net, hoping that we get something and that we put those appropriate interventions in place for your students. Thank you for intentionally spending that time to reflect. I think many a times we attend webinars or presentations and there's so much information overload that you forget these small great nuggets that are within each section. So we're going to continue on that process as we move along our presentation. And the next section, we're really going to be talking use number 2 is the integration of school-based mental health supports. And we're going to start with the why. So why use ESSER funds for integration of school mental health? And what I'll try to do is build this case here, which I don't think we need to do, but I think it's really important to see these numbers and statistics, because I think many times they're just noise in the back. So in October, this past October, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association joined together to issue a statement declaring a national state of emergency in children's mental health. We will drop that document for you today if you have not seen this. But the research and the statistics are glaring, and they can't be ignored. We have a moral and ethical obligation to be a part of this solution. We know that anxiety disorders, for example, are the most common mental health concern in the United States. Some key facts from the World Health Organization on youth mental health that was recently published in November. Globally, 1 in 7 10 to 19-year-olds experience a mental disorder, accounting for 13% of the global burden of disease in this age group. Depression, anxiety, behavioral disorders are among the leading causes of illness and disability among adolescents. Suicide is the 4th leading cause of death among 15 to 19-year-olds in the world. The consequences of failing to address adolescent mental health conditions extend into adulthood, impairing both physical and mental health and limiting opportunities to lead fulfilling, fulfilling lives as adults. We know that students spend a large amount of their time in the school system, so the school systems themselves need to be a part of this solution. Another reason for why using ESSER funds comes from the U.S. Surgeon General. If you are not aware, in December, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a rare advisory titled Protecting Youth Mental Health. A Surgeon General advisory is a public statement that calls the American people attention to action. It's an urgent public health issue. These are very rare. So it's a call to action. It's a call to action for everyone in society, from parents to students themselves, to community organizations, to for-profit businesses, and to schools and educators. We recognize that mental health is an essential part of our overall health. We want to support the mental health of children and youth in education, the community, and childcare settings. This would include creating a positive, safe, and affirming educational environment, expanding on programming that promotes healthy development, such as social emotional learning, and provides a continuum of supports that meets the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of our children and youth. The call to action specifically for schools and educators and school staff are the following. Number one, create a positive, safe, and an affirming school environment. Expand on social emotional learning programs and other evidence-based program approaches that promote healthy development. Learn how to recognize signs of changes in mental and physical health among students, including trauma and behavior changes, and take appropriate action when needed. Provide a continuum of supports that meet students' mental health needs, including evidence-based prevention practices and trauma-informed mental health care. Expand the school-based mental health care workforce. Support mental health of all school personnel. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about staff and students alike. Promote enrolling and retaining eligible children in the Medicaid, CHIP, or Marketplace plan, that so children have the health coverage needed for those behavioral health services. And protect and prioritize students with higher needs and those at risk of mental health challenges. And guess what? We don't have to do this work alone. Another resource for you is the National Center on School Mental Health. I would highly recommend putting this on your reading list and check out their latest resource of Advancing Comprehensive School Mental Health Systems. If you are not aware of this organization, I would definitely make yourself aware in the near future. Here's some more whys. We know that we need to continue with the whys. As you can see, rates of childhood mental health concerns and suicide rates rose steadily between 2010 and 2020. And our suicide rates are also up in our youth ages 10 to 24. The pandemic has intensified our mental health crisis. Some facts from the CDC that stood out to me as we were putting together this presentation was behavior problems, anxiety, depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in our children. Approximately about 9% of children receive an ADHD diagnosis, about 7% receive a diagnosis of a behavior problem, 7% of our children have a diagnosis of anxiety, and about 3% of our children ages 3 through 17 have been diagnosed with depression. Mental, behavioral, and developmental disorders begin early in childhood, and if they are not addressed, they continue on with adulthood. And we as school educators play a role in helping to curb the problems of our youth mental health. One of the ways that we're doing that here at CharacterStrong is our ingredients. Dr. Cook, if you can move on to that next slide. There we go, perfect, is our 5 ingredients. And this is just a sample from our secondary curriculum. So the experiences that children and young people have at school have a major impact on their mental health. At school, children can learn new knowledge and skills, develop close relationships with peers and supportive adults, and find that sense of purpose, fulfillment, and belonging. They can also find help to manage their mental health challenges. We know students with serious mental health challenges like anxiety disorders and clinical depression need targeted supports. But the best way to support mental health for all students is to promote well-being. And one of the ways that we do that with our curriculum are our 5 ingredients of helping our students know and do with the outcomes of better well-being, better engagement, and better levels of belonging. They're really the drivers of academic achievement, equity, school behavior, and long-term outcomes. These three things matter on an individual and communal level in order for them to arrive. And we must be thoughtful about the way that we teach our SEL and encompass a variety of skills, attitudes, and ideas. And schools are the best place to make this happen. So at CharacterStrong, our 5 ingredients are emotional understanding and regulation, how we act and how we feel, empathy and compassion, what we understand and how we care, values and purpose, who we are and what we do, goals and habits, the dreams we have and the actions we take to get there, leadership and teamwork, developing agency and working together. So we know that when students have higher well-being, they're more engaged and they feel like they belong, their academics are going to increase, their attendance is going to increase, and their behaviors are going to decrease, but their overall mental health is also going to increase as well. As we move into the how do we use these ESSER funds to support the integration of school mental health? We're going to follow that MTSS model with tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 support. So as Dr. Cook explained as we began, MTSS takes a proactive approach. And here are some quick examples in the top, or in tiers 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 are universal preventions. If you have integration of PBIS and an SEL curriculum, you're going to get the best outcomes from your students. Also, needs assessment. You have to know and understand what are the needs of your students and what are the needs of your staff. Those are going to change from semester to semester and year to year. If you think about the collective trauma that we have experienced as a group of people, we know that some people have had more trauma during the pandemic than others, but we do need to assess where our students and staff are at. Tier 2 supports would include people like me, school counselors and social workers on your campus, those student support service directors, coordinating and running small groups. These are great ways to help figure out, okay, if these tier 1 interventions aren't working and aren't getting through to the students, what do we need to do differently? Intervention models such as the PBIS model of check-in and check-out are another great resource. And then tier 3, these are our top students who after tier 1 and tier 2 supports still are not getting the supports that they need. We want to use solution-focused school counseling. There's also strong research behind cognitive behavior therapy with helping with our students with their mental health. One of the ways that we implement this is through family dares, getting our families involved with the student and what they're doing at the school. Collaborative community partnerships, specifically with mental health agencies. We know our schools cannot do this work alone. So who are those collaborative community partnerships that you can work together? Also, another targeted intervention might be home visits conducted by your administration or another school support staff member. Speaking of universal screeners, Dr. Cook put together some really great resources here. He and I get asked this question often. Okay, how do I know? Where do I find out? Who's offering these? What are the programs? So we thought we'd put this together here for you. This will also be sent out in our resources when we get done with the webinar. You'll receive some things this afternoon. Dr. Cook, anything else to add here on this slide?
Yeah, we almost have an information management problem. There's too many good screeners out there. They all function pretty similarly. People have said screeners are like toothbrushes. Everybody wants to have their own. Nobody wants to use someone else's. So from a school standpoint, it's really trying to hone in on what's the best screener. The best screeners are ones that are diagnostically accurate. They minimize false negatives and false positives. You get true hits. They're reliable and valid. They're brief, because screeners have to be brief. Screeners don't tell you what to do. They tell you, hey, this kid has a need, you might need to look into it. That's why we follow up screeners with what we call a diagnostic assessment to actually get at the underlying root cause for why the need's happening. Schools have numerous opportunities to expand the menu of interventions they make available for kids. We do a lot of work in partnership with schools to make sure kids are accessing the right interventions. And it's really about building internal capacity within schools and the infrastructure of supports within a district to make sure kids are accessing high quality interventions. If you can see in this diagram, there's lots of evidence-based interventions at the bottom, but educators need processes and methods they can follow to not only detect whether a student has a need, how do we diagnose the root cause for why that need's happening, in order to then tailor a more precise and likely effective intervention. And there's small group evidence-based in what we call acquisition-based interventions that teach kids skills. And then there's some kids are struggling and they need supports from the environment to nudge, encourage, and motivate them to use the knowledge, behaviors, and skills they do possess so they can more fully engage in their educational experiences. So really building capacity around intervention programming from beginning to end could be a really good use of ESSER funds that could help meet kids' needs now and into the future. So we think it fits within this umbrella of really prioritizing youth mental health and going after it with the ESSER funds.
All right, we're about another 15 minutes in. We just finished another section here. So pop open that chat. Let's think about what we just talked about. Maybe what is one thing that stood out to you in the integration of school-based mental health that related to building capacity for systemic change? Again, we're really talking about how can we build systemic change? What are we going to need to do now to make sure that what we're putting in place now with the funding that we have now, that it sustains time over time?
Yeah, the model in mental health, you build the community-based mental health clinic and they will come. The Field of Dreams approach is flawed. The research is very clear. If kids are going to access mental health services, the majority of kids access it through schools. That's why schools are called the de facto mental health system.
Let us know what stood out to you.
Some of the things when I look at the data that stand out to me, if you dig in a little bit around suicidal ideation and attempts, we realize it's all interconnected to student experience, and many of the precipitating factors are things that are happening in school. And so we can take a preventative effect, and we have eyeballs in terms of professionals in schools that we could take naked eyeballs and make them trained eyeballs to be able to detect needs and maybe not know what the intervention is, but make those referrals to connect kids to needed supports when they're in a time of crisis, and thinking about self-harm as an option to solve a problem.
Yeah, and I think also, giving that information to our school staff and our families, because depending upon where you're at, you might be insulated from the mental health crisis that is occurring. And I think sharing that information as to a why behind what initiatives or programmings that you're doing at your school can help that buy-in or that collaborative approach that we need from our students, particularly families and parents, as we work through this process, because we're all in this together. I'm getting ready to sing High School Musical here, Dr. Cook. Like, we are all in this together. Each of us play a critical role in prevention and also being solution focused as we move forward in this work. Great responses. Yeah, great responses here in the chat. Thank you for those reflections. Let's move on.
I'm going to move us on to the third use case here around ESSER funds. And this is really recognizing we're not going for an either or. It's not either we focus only on the kids and we neglect and don't pay attention to the adults, or we have to focus everything about the adults because they have needs now and we forget about the outcomes of kids. There's a dialectic here, and the dialectic is, when can two opposing ideas be true at the same time? We must center everything around how the adults are, because they are the catalyst around creating access to enriched experiences that students need. And we need to maintain a relentless focus on student outcomes and prioritizing our student-facing work. And so we're going to dig in here around kind of the adult piece. We're calling it adult social emotional learning, just to simplify it, but it is a bucket of work. There is a huge assumption when it comes to student-facing solutions around learning loss, their well-being and engagement. There's a giant assumption that the adults are in a good place themselves to take on those new practices and persist with implementing them with high fidelity. The most taxing thing your body can do, metabolically speaking, is to learn new things and continuously improve in those new things while you experience difficulties and challenges. So the question is always like, is this assumption being met? Are our adults in a good place where they can actually take on the student facing work? Because we can create lists and push out all the student facing work, but the question is, where are adults? What are their needs? How do we promote them and get them in as good of a place to invest in delivering the student facing work? And so we have to get good at this. When we ask the question, how our adults are doing, these are the data that come out from surveys and different types of research methods. We know that over half are contemplating leaving the profession. That's why we now have a cliche, the Great Resignation, that's being applied not only to education, but other service sectors. 91% of teachers are experiencing stress and fatigue, where they indicate it's impairing some aspect of their professional life functioning. Less than 1/3 of teachers report feeling engaged in their job. Now, I'm not here to just admire the problem. Here is where the solution comes. Yet, when asked, only 2% of educators say there's nothing their school leaders can do to address the factors affecting stress, well-being, and engagement. So there is the optimism. They see that there's solutions. There's viable solutions that school systems can undertake to create the conditions that promote the adults' well-being and engagement as it relates to creating access to experiences for students. So what do we know about adult SEL? This is the research, and I've published multiple studies. There's other colleagues who've really looked into the adult piece, because if you're interested in implementation is all about adult behavior change. In order to create access to student experience, we have to then bring the humanity back into the work and really ask how our adults are doing, what's getting in the way of their ability to take on and deliver all those effective practices that we know students need. And the research is quite clear. Adults who are unwell and struggling aren't really good implementers when it comes to take on new practices, so students access higher quality experiences and supports. We know that stress and overwhelmed educators unintentionally, no educator gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to lay into a kid today, or I'm going to engage in behaviors that may be offensive or harmful to my relationship with my colleagues. But nonetheless, stress and overwhelmed educators unintentionally engage in behaviors that contribute to a negative climate. And we know that educators who don't feel adequately valued, supported with good professional learning and time are likely to, I'm going to fix my camera here, are likely to have a greater likelihood of leaving the profession, up to 15 times more likely. And educators exist within environments where they're not feeling adequately valued, supported, and respected for what they do. So here's how we kind of think about this work. How do we go from, thinking about the student facing work to the adult facing? And I'm just going to hone us in on one piece here. This is a logic model where we have kind of our student facing experiences and outcomes we want. There's things we know students need to access daily and consistently in order to produce outcomes like sense of belonging, well-being, engagement in school. Those put kids on a pathway towards more distal outcomes like achievement, being life ready, career and college readiness. Now, the adult piece is critical because it's cause and effect. What causes the effects we want in terms of students accessing the experiences they need and the outcomes we want for students? And there's two pieces for the adult piece. There's going to be effective practices that, if implemented, like let's say a tier 1 SEL curriculum, that's going to increase students' access to high quality teaching and learning experiences that can cultivate certain outcomes like acquisition and use of competencies that promote self-regulation. A sense of belongingness because there's classroom community-based activities that are about building relationships. Now, the adult piece is all about preconditions. Preconditions are before adults are in a place to invest in implementing those effective practices, there's certain beliefs, knowledge, mindsets, and well-being indicators that need to be in place in order for them to make that investment. And that's where the adult piece, we start to get very strategic. What are the beliefs? What's the mindsets? And what are the well-being indicators that need to be in place for our adults in order for them to invest in delivering the practices that are student facing so students can access the experiences they need. So we get really, really good. And this is where our implementation supports come in. We're wrapping around supports for our adults to get those essential preconditions in place that are enablers and facilitators of them being able to invest in practices that represent student-facing solutions. And we can list what all the practices we want staff to be doing, but the question is, where are our people at? Where are they at in terms of their beliefs, their motivation, and their own well-being to have the motivation and energy to invest in delivering those practices? So one way we start to get good at this, and this is how ESSER funds can be used, is a root cause analysis. That gets thrown around a lot in education, but how do we do a really, really good root cause analysis? What you're seeing here is called the fishbone diagram. And it's just a diagram, so we start to think about causes and effects. The effects are the outcomes we're seeing. So what are the outcomes you're seeing among your adults? Those are the effects. We're seeing high rates of stress. We're seeing burnout, disengagement, and turnover intentions or actual turnover. The next question is, what are the causes of that? What are the organizational causes? Things that are happening within the organization that people are saying are causing them to feel these ways and producing those effects. We got to do a good root cause analysis because that's where we want to target the solution. If we do blanket solutions like self-care, we're just going to ask our educators to self-care their way out of it. If you look at the data, that is not the solution that educators are asking for. They're looking for organizational supports and methods that enable them to be well. So they're more organizationally focused types of strategies and techniques that are going to help educators get through these times. And individual strategies, what's going on individually where we can support individuals with healthy routines, habits, skills, and competencies, their own social emotional competencies to navigate adversity, to be tough and resilient in the face of tough times. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more. So we start to link hypothesized root causes to solutions, and this is how the work can really unfold to identify and then think strategically about implementing solutions that are going to be effective now and going into the future. So one example is we see, if you dig into this, you see some staff get stuck on what we call external factors that go beyond their control. And so they're stuck, and what that does is when people are stuck focusing on external factors, it produces a wear and tear on their minds, body, and energy. So there's methods that can be used to help staff shift and persist and focus on those things that they do have control over, that align with their values, and can still make a difference despite everything going on. And that work, people who spend more time in an internal locus of control state feel more hopeful, they're more energized, have a greater sense of vitality. And I'll just walk you through a couple of ways in which root cause analysis can start within any given system, can start pinpointing solution. Lack of appreciation and feeling valued. So we have to create systems in which people genuinely get recognized and acknowledged for who they are. Just that's their intrinsic, you have an intrinsic worth as a person. It's not just transactional based on what you do, but also paying close attention when we see energy and effort. How do we notice it and recognize it and make people feel appreciated for what they're doing in the wake of everything going on to make a difference in kids' lives? Low efficacy. Our research, we've gone around the country, we take assessments. This is the main driver of staff stress and burnout. Low efficacy to meet the current needs of students, whether it's behavioral challenge, some of the mental health needs. They're not feeling confident in their ability to rise to the occasion and meet students' needs, given everything that's going on and all the competing demands for their time. So part of this is developing solutions where we know what are the areas of low self-efficacy, providing very targeted professional learning and supports, inclusive of giving time to staff for collaboration, exchange of ideas, and planning in order to continuously improve and build confidence around addressing some of the student needs where they're currently thinking, well, I look in my bag of toolkit tricks and I'm not finding the types of solutions that I have control over to address students' needs. And the last is just too many things going on. People feeling a sense of being overwhelmed with all kinds of expectations to do it all. When people feel so many competing demands for their time and not enough time to pull it off, this is where prioritization from leadership is essential to identify what matters most. We have to be willing to deprioritize and take things off people's plates. The situation is ripe for burnout because many people are rigidly adhering to expectations that were built for pre-pandemic times. Yet when you ask people, do we need to, when there's adversity and challenge, do we need to adapt and be flexible? Virtually everybody will say yes, but we're not seeing those skills be used from a school system perspective to really adapt and be flexible in the face of the adversity, which means we got to prioritize based on what needs among staff and student are most important. And priorities are essentially things that are more important relative to other things. So it really requires a deep dive into identifying the vital subset of activities that are the most important things we can be doing now relative to other things. And we have to give people permission to let go of certain other things so it feels manageable and feasible to them.
Lots of great comments in the chat so far. So as we continue on with our reflection after each section, what is one thing that stood out to you in the adult SEL section related to building capacity for that systemic change that we are working towards? And Dr. Cook and I were joking around about the self-care Saturday and this toxic positivity around self-care. We know it's more than self-care. So what is one thing that you could share in the chat that stood out to you about adult SEL and systemic change? Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. We got to prioritize our priorities, and that the permission to take things off the plate. Perfect. As we know there were some questions in the chat. We'll give Dr. Cook a chance to take a look at those. And as we wrap up and close out our session today, we want to do a couple reminders here. So systemic and sustainable change, that's really been the theme about what we have been talking about today. Our national organizations and state, federal agencies have called attention to the crisis that we have in mental health and well-being. Along with calling attention, there also has to be really great frameworks and guidance. And we can tell you that there are really great frameworks and guidance to help us redesign and reimagine our educational systems to better serve our students, staff, and communities. Several examples that we'll drop in the chat for you are the Office of the Surgeon General Advisory. Lots of really great resources, frameworks, ideas to get started. The AASA, a Learning, Recovery, and Redesign Guidance Framework. Even if you're not a superintendent, I would take a look at that framework. There's a lot of really intentional resources built there. And then, of course, school counselors play an integral role in this process. So making sure that we have a comprehensive school counseling program in place at our schools so that we can set things up for that systemic change. The question here is, we must begin with the end in mind to build capacity to use data to inform impact, along with adjusting plans as you move along with implementation. As Mark Twain once famously said, the secret to getting ahead is getting started. The time is now. This is the time to intentionally and strategically plan for that systemic and sustainable change. As one educator recently stated in our last listening session, more money means more initiatives, means more on my plate. And doesn't that resonate? Let's remember that we need to be intentionally strategic about our plans so that we can implement programs with fidelity without overburdening our overburdened staff already. I believe, Dr. Cook and I both believe, that AASA Learning, Recovery, and Redesign Guidance summarizes this work the best. We're sprinting and running a marathon at the same time as we work through this work to response, recovery, and redesign. This work is not going to be easy. Dr. Cook and I are definitely not here to profess that this is just a checkbox and things are going to be done easily. This is going to require some time, effort, and energy on everyone's part to make sure that we can sustain change for the future. And 3, 2, 1. What are 3 things you learned or reminded of today? 2 ideas you want to learn more about, and 1 commitment. We always like to end our sessions with that recall. A lot of information that you received from us today. So we want to make sure that while you're in the moment, if you could give us a 3, a 2, and a 1. If you can't get a 3 and a 2, we'll take a 1, or we'll take a 3, or we'll take a 2. We'll take anything here for your reflection as we close out. Dr. Cook, you want to close out with our dare for the session?
Yeah, this is kind of routine for webinars at CharacterStrong. We like to close with a character dare, and it's really a challenge to try to apply some of the information beyond the learning. So our character dare is just thinking about what next steps for your district or school are. As you're thinking about ESSER funds, how they could be used very strategically. We have some prompting questions here that really kind of enable you to take some of the lessons learned here and go beyond this webinar. And what does it take for backwards design? How do we start to think about the end in mind and work backwards as we design and identify solutions? What measures and assessments do you already have to determine the effectiveness of how things are working currently in order to make some course corrections and refinements? Who are your collaborative partners? Do you need collaborative partners to help facilitate this work? Do ESSER funds provide those opportunities? And ultimately, thinking about that potential funding cliff with ESSER funds, they will go away in September 2024. How do you start to build for sustainability beyond that? So we just want to say thank you for being here. We have some upcoming events that we would really encourage you to plug in. Some of these are around our curriculum. As you can see, we have some webinars and demos around implementation that will be hosted by our customized implementation supports. We have a variety of resources that you can come and learn about through some of our demos and webinar opportunities. So we'd really encourage you to plug into that. I want to thank you all for being adaptable and flexible with my camera. As I was talking about adaptation and flexibility, something's going on with my computer. And just like, what are you leaving excited about today? Recognizing that through these crises and tough times, there are opportunities to identify things that represent opportunities for change and improvement. Things we should have got to perhaps before the pandemic, but they're pretty clear and visible now. We have a good line of sight on them, on what types of changes we need to make in our schools. So we're promoting the well-being of both staff and students.
Yeah, and just some reminders here that really the 3 concepts we talked about today was implementation of MTSS, integration of school-based mental health, and prioritizing adult emotional learning with your ESSER 3 funds. Those top 3 ways were from the AASA Learning, Recovery, Redesign guidance. They have a template and a framework where they are talking about response, recovery, and redesign while you're running a sprint and a marathon at the same time. So that link was in the chat today, but we will also send all of the links with the description of which each of them are out to you after today. And then Dr. Cook, there is a couple questions about the adult SEL Not sure if we have enough time to answer both of them, but how can we address adult SEL when schools are understaffed, resistant staffed, and communities and do not have strong administrators or leadership?
Yeah, I think that's you've pinpointed one of the, I think about what things are beyond our control that can make a difference despite some of the challenges. If we focus on, and that's one of the organizational strategies, if we really feed into leadership as being pivotal change agents to promote a positive school culture and climate that promotes the well-being and engagement of staff, that's a great starting place. We often work with school systems in partnership to invest in leaders around their knowledge around how to create and co-create through a shared leadership team a really healthy culture and climate, and recognize that leaders have control over their behaviors, and those actions can be very positive and help create a climate. And climate is ultimately how people think about and feel about being in that place. And there's very strategic behaviors, not out of coercion, but out of care for the well-being of the adults. And so the more we invest in our leaders on what they have control over to create the conditions, despite some of the barriers and challenges to that work, it can be very facilitative and promotive of the adult well-being piece, even during situations of shortage, oftentimes community unrest around some of the actions that schools are undertaking for justified reasons.
We know that you are perfectly positioned to do this work. Take some time to reflect and think about what your next steps are. Remember, this work cannot be done in silos, and there are resources, community organizations, for-profit, nonprofit organizations that are willing and able to help along with this work. And continue to be well. And thank you from both of us, from a place of gratitude and appreciation, for continuing to be in a place where you impact students and staff on a daily basis. We appreciate your time of giving up your time to be with us today, and we will be sending out some follow-up resources and links, the recording, the slide deck, more information, and join Dr. Cook and his staff at more webinars later this month. Make it a great day.
Yep, make it a good one, everybody. Take care. Use those ESSER funds.
Use the money. Spend, spend, spend.
Build capacity.